Okay, and then we are going to move on to screen share. Okay. Let me make sure that I have that guy open. All right. And off we go. So welcome so much to I Don't a Rod, the Loose Leash Walking Hacks and Techniques webinar. It is a play on the word I did a rod, which is the famous dog sled race. It's a joke that my friend Ashley came up with because she's like the queen of dad jokes. Because I say to my dogs, if they're pulling, hey, this isn't the Iditarod. And I said it to one of my dogs when I was walking with her, and she said, that's your webinar name. I don't a rod. It's very silly. It did cause a little bit of confusion, but also got some attention, which it was meant to. So welcome so much to I Don't a Rod. I'm Sarah. I'm a certified dog behavior consultant. I have a podcast called Cog Dog Radio, and I run a membership and a classroom over at Cog Dog Classroom. And I hope that you'll join me over there. The membership has all of my webinars I've ever done. It will have this one when it wraps up, and it will have all of the rest of them. And it has some courses, and it has a really, really great community, which is the big reason to join, in my opinion. So what are we going to talk about tonight? We are going to talk about why loose leash walking, why it's hard, why you need it. We're going to talk about what your management tool options are. We're going to talk about antecedents. We're going to talk about how to set the stage for loose leash walking, how to help your dog actually do this better by arranging the environment, manipulating the environment instead of the dog. Then I'm going to get into my techniques and my hacks. So a technique is actually a training procedure or a handling procedure, and a hack is like a cheat. It's like something that I do to help myself and my dog to do this better. So here's the thing. Loose leash walking, and I'm going to use LLW throughout to stand for loose leash walking. It's hard. It's really tough because of a mismatched kind of desired speed or pace. If your dog is off leash, you notice that they go much faster than you go. They probably run, they might trot, but they're definitely going faster than you are. We also have incompatible agendas. When we go on a walk, we want to like walk in a straight line and look at stuff. Or we might want to meander, but we're probably on a trail and we're looking at stuff. Dogs want to do a lot of meandering. They want to do zigzagging. I've lost my cursor. Sorry, y'all. Trying to admit, folks, but it was working. So we have incompatible agendas. Dogs, if left to their own devices, are like all over the place. They're going to go this way. They're going to go behind. They're going to zigzag. They're going to sniff everywhere. That's an incompatible agenda. That's not how humans walk. When you watch humans walking without dogs or like with dogs on leashes, they're pretty much walking on the sidewalk, on the trail, in a line. They are not on the same page as far as what they would like to have happen. Sorry, you guys. Got another. I need to hire a Zoom expert because it certainly isn't me. Lack of awareness of tension on both ends is a really big deal. So humans tend not to be as aware as we should be of pulling on the leash. So when I get called in to help somebody with loose leash walking, I tend to have a look at their walking, and I tend to find that the dog is pulling off and on most of the time, and folks are not aware of the fact that they're doing it until they're being yanked over, until it is a problem for them. This picture is a really good example. I don't think any of these dogs are pulling to a problematic level for their particular handlers, but each of these dogs is experiencing leash tension. They're probably not aware of it, and the people are not really aware of it either. So that lack of awareness of tension on both ends is a big part of why this is challenging. Reinforcement history, of course, always a problem if you have a certain agenda and you have allowed an opposing agenda to be reinforced for any length of time, you're in trouble. If the dog shows up with 5 years of pulling history, we're going to need some help. We're probably going to need a device. We're going to need big, heavy, hefty intervention to kind of get through that, versus a brand new puppy who has no history of anything. So reinforcement history always going to be a part of what's going on. Also, yes, it's hard. It is totally worth it. It is a self-regulation exercise. You kind of get self-regulation as a bonus. They have to control themselves in order to maintain a slack leash, because again, it is counter to everything that they would like to be doing. So because it's not what they'd like to be doing, they'd like to be pulling hard into the leash. They'd like to be, zigzagging everywhere. They'd like to be going much faster than you. They have to control themselves in order to maintain that slack leash. So it is a self-regulation exercise, and you can use that to your advantage in sports. You will enjoy walking this dog more on a leash anyway than you did before. I know for me, I don't really walk my dogs on leashes recreationally. When I exercise them recreationally, they are off leash. But my dogs who are the best about not pulling are the most enjoyable to walk recreationally on leash. And if I lived in situations, and I have lived in situations where they were walked more often recreationally on leash, if they were good about it, they did it really, really nicely for me. Sport venues are going to be much easier to navigate for you and the dog. If the dog understands not to be, dragging on you all the time, if they understand that the two of you kind of need to move in unison through the venue, it's going to be easier for both of you. Which is why I believe this is a more pleasant experience in a sport venue or not for both ends of the leash. I don't think that they like to be dragging into a collar or harness any more than we like to be dragged. Some dogs certainly like to pull into a harness. That's very different from the kind of frenetic pushing and pulling and dragging that we see, that we're always trying to combat when it comes to loose leash walking. So this always comes up. Are we going to manage this, or are we going to train it? Management meaning, are we going to manipulate the environment, use a device, use a tool in which we can manage this forever, or are we going to actually teach the dog to maintain a slack leash? Most people on earth with dogs choose to manage this forever because you can. You can manage this forever with tools. We got benefits though. So think about that previous slide. There are benefits to training it. We've got the self-regulation. We've got the mutual enjoyment. Those are all reasons to dig in and train this behavior. I think that if you are going to be competing in sports, the fact that sport venues become much easier for you to navigate with that dog means that you should, I think, dig in and train this behavior instead of manage it forever. And also, what about dogs? Every single tool on the market that manages loose leash walk, that manages leash pulling for you, is aversive in nature. Let me paint you a picture. What is an aversive? It is something that the dog will work to avoid. That's it. That's all it is. So it could be literally anything. in different contexts. So like, for instance, my dog Idju likes to bark at me at certain times, and I pet her when she barks at me in those times. She likes petting. She's a sweet dog. She comes up to me and I pet her all the time. But in certain contexts, when she's going to bark at me, the petting qualifies as an aversive. She will work to avoid it. A front connection harness, same as a prong collar, does not feel good when the dog pulls into it. They don't feel good for different reasons, but neither of them feel good. They both qualify as aversives because the dog's kind of working to avoid them. If the dog continues to pull super hard into whatever the tool is, whether it's just your flat collar and it's not, not really designed to manage walking, or it's a prong collar, if they're pulling really hard into it, then the pressure on it doesn't qualify as an aversive, period. So leash pressure, by its very nature, by and large, in and of itself is going to have a range of kind of its aversive quality depending on the dog that we're talking about. I like these dogs to not have to walk on an aversive tool for the rest of their life. That's a preference I have. It doesn't have to be a preference that you have. And it's one of the reasons that I train instead of manage forever. So let's talk about what your management tool options actually are. We have the lovely arrow demonstrating literally all of them. I was wanting to gather individual pictures of each of these things. I was worried about asking for it on the internet. And so I just asked someone who I know owns every piece of equipment that exists. And I had them pose the dog with all of them. So don't feel bad for this dog. It was just a posed picture. He's very well cared for, I can attest. We've got a head collar, a gentle leader, halty, whatever you want to call it, classic management tool for loose leash walking. Got a prong collar, which comes in both plastic and metal. Got a front connection harness, so that's any harness that connects on the front of the body, the front of the chest, which gives you a lot more leverage against the dog. The dog is also wearing a slip collar, so a slip collar or a choke collar could also be used to manage loose leash walking. These things have various levels of effectiveness for the actual task at hand. Some of them aren't very effective at all unless the human puts a lot of pressure on them, and some of them aren't effective until they are conditioned or trained. But these are your options. This is a neutral slide. I am not suggesting a single thing on this slide. I am simply explaining to you what your options are. So just let the record show that I am explaining to you what your options are. I am not suggesting anything on this slide. What I am going to suggest is that you set yourself up for success. I suggest this no matter what it is that you're training, but this is essentially antecedent arrangements. Setting yourself up for success means that you manipulate the environment, you manipulate the conditions to make loose leash walking more likely. Biggest thing you can do for yourself, and I know I'm a broken record and it doesn't matter what I'm talking about, off-leash exercise is going to come up. Off-leash exercise, one of the biggest things you can do, because if we go back to that initial slide about why this is so difficult, dogs wanting to go faster and be free is one of the reasons it's so hard. So if you give them a lot of opportunities to go faster and be free, it helps you to work on loose leash walking. Carson, my puppy, is actively working on loose leash walking right now in one environment outside of at home. And that is after an off-leash hike. So we have done a big off-leash walk, and now we leash walk the last quarter mile or so to the car. Sorry for the interruptions, everybody. Freedom of movement as a precursor is actually going to make you the most successful at this. If your dogs are pent and under-exercised, and maybe they're not under-exercised, but they have a limited amount of freedom of movement in their life, asking them to control their movement on a string for you is going to be extremely hard for them to do. So off-leash exercise is a big, big part of setting yourself up for success. I love to provide a big freedom of movement outlet and then train loose leash walking. So I love an off leash hike, then train loose leash. You could play fetch and then work on it. Like you could use your control device on the way to the park, throw the ball in the park, and then try to walk on your flat collar on the way home. It depends on what works for you. It depends on what your particular situation is. But if you are a person, and I know plenty of people here are, who trains the general public, you want to emphasize this. You want to make sure that these dogs are getting good amounts of freedom of movement, especially if the people are struggling a lot with loose leash exercise. Okay, there are some core skills for the dogs. Core skills that dogs need to understand in order to be able to do this. Because remember, they're not super aware of the fact that there's tension on the leash. This varies dog to dog. Some dogs are super aware of it, just right out the gate. Those dogs tend to be kind of sensitive to things touching them or things pulling on their body in general. But a lot of them really aren't sensitive to this at all. And so the core skills that they need to be taught actively would be to yield to collar on the equipment, or I'm sorry, yield to pressure on the equipment. I usually am using a collar to teach this rather than a harness. So that's why I messed up and said collar. So pressure yield is one of the first things that we're going to teach. That's really simple. That's seeing pressure in the collar as a cue to move into that pressure rather than pull against it, which is what their natural inclination is going to be. They're going to need to understand reinforcement delivery. They're going to, and that's a variety of different types of reinforcement delivery. They need to understand how to be told to access something in the environment as a reinforcer, as well as how to accept food as a reinforcer and potentially even other reinforcers like toys. A core skill for good loose leash walking is actually engagement in a variety of environments. If you go to a new environment and the dog is like, well, you're invisible now, that is not going to bode well for loose leash walking. If you're invisible and you're attached by this string that the dog has very little knowledge about, very little knowledge of, you are fighting a losing battle, you are swimming upstream. And I don't want that for you. So working on engagement in environments is good. I'm not going to go super in depth on engagement. The reason is it deserves its own webinar, and there are plenty of, like, just literally Google engagement dog training and you will find a bunch of different resources. And then you can use your discretion to decide which ones of those are good. But there's plenty of them. And I haven't seen any of them that are like really bad. So like, I think it's okay. I think it's a safe thing for you to Google and go do. They have to be comfortable in the equipment. This is a big one. If they are uncomfortable wearing the collar or having the leash on or the harness or whatever it is that you want to walk them on, that's something you have to work on first. One of the drawbacks of using a management tool is usually those tools need more work to get the dog comfortable in them. My dogs, generally speaking, wear a harness and a collar. Those are the two pieces of equipment that I am going to use. I do use a harness that has a front connection option because usually there's a period of time in adolescence when I'd like a little bit more management on this skill, and I like the dog already comfortable in that harness so that I can use it at that time. So I use a balance harness, and I usually just have the puppy wear it most of the time so that they are desensitizing to it. And then of course a collar. Puppies usually are kind of uncomfortable in collars. You slap it on them, they wear it all the time, they get comfortable. That is kind of the route that I take with harnesses too, if the dog's not panicking about it. But if you want to use a gentle leader or something less comfortable than just a standard harness or a standard collar, you are going to need to work on comfort in the equipment. I'm also not going to go in depth on teaching those things. I essentially just told you how I would, and I would do it even if I was training a gentle leader. I'd teach the dog to put it on, but then I'd pretty much slap it on. I wouldn't attach a leash, and we would go out and we would do stuff. So that's pretty much how I operate with collars and harnesses as well. They got to be comfortable in the environment. If the dog is freaking out, if they're panicking about the traffic, or if they're lunging at other dogs, they're freaking out about other things in the environment, you cannot expect them to also self-regulate and keep that leash loose. So I would recommend, in the case of discomfort in the environment, you simply use a management tool while you build that comfort in the environment. And again, that deserves its own webinar, and that webinar is not this one. There are also some core skills for the humans. One of them is going to be that your leash remains anchored on you. If, when the dog pulls, you bungee arm out, so that means that you allow the dog to pull your arm out from your body and then you bungee back, you are going to be less effective than if you keep your leash anchored to your body. There are a variety of reasons for that. I'm not going to go super in depth, but essentially keeping an anchored leash will make a difference for you. So think about it, work on it. It is tough. You will find that you've been bungeeing your whole life with dogs. I find it, you're going to see in a couple of the videos that I actually make the mistake still. So it is one of those things to keep reminding yourself to keep your leash really anchored to your body. I like to just keep it anchored kind of to your core, to your waist, or to your side, depending on how big your dog is. A big deal core skill about this is going to be predictive actions. You have to be proactive and not reactive. So what does that mean? And why is that so tough? A lot of loose leash walking protocols are reactive protocols. When the dog pulls, you do X. Right? You guys have heard this. So when the dog pulls, you circle. When the dog pulls, you stop. When the dog pulls, you go the opposite direction. I don't want you to wait for the dog to pull. I want you to be proactive. I want you to predict that they're going to pull and then insert whatever the technique is that you're going to use. And don't worry, I'm going to go in depth on those techniques. So being able to predict when the dog is actually going to hit leash pressure is vital. If you can't do that, or if you won't pay enough attention to be doing that, or you can't pay enough attention for long enough, use your management tool when you want to just relax and then switch to your desired tool. So you might use your management harness and then switch to your desired flat collar for like 5 minutes when you're going to be ultra focused, and then go ahead and switch back and go back on your walk. I'm also going to show you a technique that I call the leash to collar slide. And the reason being, what I find is that you're holding the leash on one end. And then if you want to control the dog a little bit more, you want to implement a technique that involves a shorter leash, you're grabbing at the leash. Much smarter to just anchor both hands and slide to wherever your desired spot is. So the leash to collar, or just halfway to collar, it's not always all the way to collar. Slide is another core skill for the human to learn to implement. So let's dive into the pressure yield part. Something that you can look up, there is a free video series on YouTube from Guide Dogs for the Blind on collar cues, and I really like it. And if you are teaching pet dog training classes in particular, I would love it if you would go check out those videos. It is a training procedure designed by Michelle Pouliot, and it's genius. It's really brilliant. So I'm not going to steal that and commandeer it and teach it to you. It's available on YouTube for free through the Guide Dogs for the Blind. I think their YouTube channel is Guide Dogs Are Great, but you can Guide Dogs, collar cues, you will find it. It will help you if you want more help than what I'm about to give you on the pressure yield. I would like leash pressure to act as a cue to stop, slow down, or move towards. Basically, what they're going to do is those three things. They're going to slow down, stop, move towards me if the pressure did not cease. So those things are going to happen kind of in succession. it's my job to teach that as a cue, because like I said, they're not super aware of the fact that they're pulling. It is only going to be as strong as its reinforcement history in relation to the history that's already present. So let me give you some examples of what that means. And remember, always remember, dogs are not super naturally aware of this. Okay, we kind of are, we're a lot more naturally aware of it, but we're still not as good as we kind of think we are or as we should be. But it's only as strong as its reinforcement history in relation to the environmental history. So here's what that means. If my dog has a strong history of pulling me towards other dogs, that could be in a dog park setting, like we're walking to the dog park from the car and they're pulling me in. That could be just anytime they see their buddies on the street, they pull me towards. Then in the environment that the context is other dogs, I'm going to need to really, really build a very strong history of yielding to collar before the dog's ever going to be able to access that skill in the presence of the other cue. So it really is just two cues that are present. The collar cue that you are presenting, if you have taught it, as well as the cue of the other dog saying, pull towards me. One of the biggest questions that I get about loose leash walking over my membership is, but what if a squirrel runs by, or what if a bunny runs by? Like my dog walks on a loose leash until the squirrel, the bunny, that's another cue that has a strong history. Your collar cues need to outweigh that history for them to be relevant enough in that situation. So if your dog has a strong history, say chasing rabbits, chasing squirrels, whatever, it's really important for you to probably use a management device in those scenarios where that's possible. And if you're like me, and honestly, the reason I care so much about this is because my body's in pain all the time. And if a dog yanks on me, I can be debilitated for the next 12 hours or more. And so that's why I've developed so much of this and why my dogs are pretty good about it. And if anybody's been around me with my dogs, they know that they are. It's really just because it hurts me. So if I am walking a dog on a leash who is likely to forget himself and yank me if he sees something, that dog is never going to walk on a flat collar for me. That dog's going to walk on a management device for me as a person. That's a choice that you're going to want to make. Now, I do work really, really hard with my dogs, and I'm working really hard on it right now with Carson, my puppy, on choosing to orient to me when they see exciting or interesting stuff in the environment. And this is a big reason why I want to build that reinforcement history for choosing to orient towards me. Because if I'm not building that, then what I am building is the reinforcement history for pulling towards other stuff or going towards other stuff. And it's going to be hard to build that pressure yield as a cue that can actually outweigh the other cue. And it's really important that you don't escalate the cue and just pull harder on them. There are other things that you can do that we can kind of go into in the Q&A section if we choose to, but it is important that we don't escalate the cue into just heavier pressure, because I want the dog to respond to kind of feather light pressure, and they won't if they have a history of cue escalation. That's a general dog training tip, that if you are in the habit of escalating cues, the cue the dog actually eventually responds to is the one that becomes the real cue. And I'm guilty of it as much as anybody else, but it's something we do try to avoid as best practice. All right, here's a little video of me and my little girlie, Rhea. Rhea is my first Spitz type dog. And so certainly my most pulley little baby that I've ever raised, because my border collies tend to pull when they're pulling you towards something. They tend to pull in anticipatory behavior, but not just like as a general rule. A lot of people with border collies don't work very hard on loose leash walking because they are naturally averse to leash pressure more than a lot of other breeds are. And so they just kind of don't pull that hard. For me, they can't pull at all. And so I do work on it with my border collies, but this is Rhea. just practicing some of this pressure yield behavior. And I'll remind you, if you have questions about this, scratch them down on a piece of paper. You can put them in the chat at the very end, and that's when I'll go through questions. So I just pull her in one direction. When she responds to it, I mark and reward. I am practicing leash to collar slide here as well. So I'm not snatching at the leash, I'm sliding down. So I'm maintaining those good mechanics throughout. And sometimes I ask her to go in unnatural places that she says that's really stupid, but I insist, and then she gives in and says, okay, fine. And she's gonna bark at me there because I'm really asking a lot. Good girl. So this is something that I teach initially with food. And when we get into the reinforcement, you're going to see that I don't use food to maintain loose leash walking, but I do use it to teach collar pressure yield. And if you've been around Rhea, you know that she really doesn't pull on leash. She's really perfect, she says. And she is. It's the truth. Okay, so that's a little pressure yield video. I could talk about pressure yield for about a year. So again, encourage you to check out the Guide Dogs series. And I do encourage you to dig into that deeper if you would like to. But let's dive into some of the techniques. So those are the prereq skills for dogs and humans. Let's jump now into techniques. I'm going to talk about 3 primary techniques that I have named cutely, or attempted to name cutely: power steering, slow your roll, and hey this way. Starting with power steering. I use 2 points of connection on the dog for power steering. It's a non-negotiable. It is how the system works. So a harness that has a front and back connection, or you can use a collar and a back connection harness, or you use a collar and a front connection harness, or you use a collar and a gentle leader. It doesn't matter. One of the points gives you more leverage than the other point. That's what matters. So for plenty of dogs, the collar itself, because of the collar pressure work, is enough leverage that I can work with a back connection harness and a collar. But for most dogs, I'm doing this with a balance harness, or any of the other harnesses on the market that have 2 points of connection, one on the chest and one on the back. I like to use a double-ended leash, no longer than 6 feet. I like about 4 feet. If it's longer than 6 feet, it's way too cumbersome. For a short dog, 6 feet is about right. For a taller dog, 4 feet's about right. With power steering, you're going to communicate to the dog about tension with the front connection, or the connection that gives you more leverage. So it might be that gentle leader, it might be a different no pull device, but whatever the video is going to show you the front connection harness. So you're going to communicate to the dog about tension with the front connection, but your goal is to get to the less aversive or less intense connection. And so you're kind of holding both parts of the leash, but your goal is to only hold on to whatever part of the leash you'd like to eventually hold on to. So let's say I'm using a gentle leader and a flat collar. I'd like to eventually use the flat collar. I'm going to act as if I'm only walking the dog on the flat collar unless I need to communicate about tension via the gentle leader. I'm going to show you the video, and I hope that will make everything nice and clear. So if you've got those questions, again, jot them down, and I want them in the end. Here are some steps. And we've got Bruce here demonstrating 2 points of connection on his harness. Lovely little German Spitz that I got to meet over in Wales. He's the cutest. So you're going to indicate verbally to the dog that you're going to turn the dog before the dog starts to pull. Broken record on this. You have to be proactive, not reactive. When you're predicting the pulling, you indicate verbally that you're going to turn the dog. When the dog starts to hit the tension, you're going to use your steering to turn the dog in the other direction. If the dog does not hit the tension, you're fine. You can actually continue forward movement. So I'm going to tell the dog as they're moving into the pulling, hey, we're going to turn. And I'm going to slide my hand towards that connection that's going to help me turn them. So that's the front connection or the management tool. If they don't hit the tension, I'm going to keep walking forward. That's an important part because they learn to avoid hitting the tension this way because they don't want you to turn them. I turn them two different ways. I turn them towards and I turn them away. So let's talk about that. We've got two turning techniques. We've got the turn toward that requires way more handling savvy from the human, but it is more effective and it works faster. So when I'm working with really skilled folks, sport folks, or other professional trainers, I'm usually going straight into this guy. If I am working with my mom trying to walk a dog, I am going to the turn away, which is much easier to do, but it is less effective and it works slower. However, also, if they're not dog trainers, it does work fast enough and they usually feel satisfied. So it tends to work out either way. So you're either going to turn towards the dog. So if the dog is on my left, I'm going to slide my hand towards that management device and turn towards. If the dog is on my left and I want to turn away, I'm still going to slide towards the management device and I'm going to turn away. But I'm going to verbally tell the dog I'm going to do that. I'm going to wait for them to start to hit tension. That's not waiting for them to like, boom, hit the end of the leash. It is waiting for slight tension to build. Then I'm going to do it and I'm going to move. Again, jot your questions down. I'll take them at the end. Let's look at video. So here we have sliding towards, that's the leash to collar slide, and I'm going to turn away. So that is the turn away piece. I'm using two leashes here instead of a double connection. So, and that is our turn towards. So I put it in slow motion. As soon as the dog loosens up, I also loosen up. So I'm going to verbally tell him here, and then I'm going to slide down and turn. And I'm trying to tell him to get away from me and stop healing, but he says he can't. Okay, but then he got ahead of me and I moved down towards that front connection. I was able to turn towards him and move him away. Okay. I have a feeling we might want to see that again, so I'm going to start it over. So as he starts to pull, I tell him, I slide my hand down to that front connection or towards the stem of the gentle leader or whatever, and I turn away. Or alternatively, I slide down and turn towards. And you see him just kind of pivot in, and he definitely gave a lip lick there, not his favorite. Here we go. I don't want to get lost. That's just for the sake of the video. So I'm doing lots of sliding in and turning him in. So I slide down towards and I use that pressure to turn him. All right, next technique is going to be slow your roll. I have to be honest with you. This is the one that I use most often in real life if I'm actually out and about with my dog and not training. And it is way more effective than the classic kind of red light, green light that we all learned if we've been in dog training for more than 5 seconds. So red light, green light being the dog is pulling, you freeze, the dog slackens the leash, you start walking again. Really classically builds a yo-yo effect. There's reasons for that I could dive into as far as what dogs understand about what people are doing and whatever, but slow your roll works way better. It's really simple. You're going to walk briskly, quickly. You're going to walk at a pace the dog prefers. I don't expect you to run or jog, which most dogs would prefer the most, but you're going to walk quickly when the dog is not pulling. And when the dog starts to pull, when you get tension on the leash, you are going to walk at a snail's pace. You are going to keep moving, but you're going to walk stupidly slow. This works because dogs are familiar with you doing both things. They're familiar with you walking fast and walking really, really slow, versus just stopping is kind of another cue entirely. That's why it produces the yo-yo effect, and the dog kind of notices you stopped finally and they sit or they come over to you. They don't slacken the leash. This way, when you really, I mean, and you're walking like painfully slow, they go, oh, we're going slow now, and they slow down, and then you speed up and you reward the fact that the leash went slack. It works the best. It's the hardest for people to do, of course, right? So it requires very astute observation of what is happening on the end of the leash, and this is mentally exhausting. So some of your clients are not going to be capable of it. Some of you are not going to be capable of it, because you're not going to notice in time that the dog is pulling, because you've got to be, it's got to be instantaneous. The second that leash is tight, you switch into slow motion. And the second it is loose again, you switch back into a quick pace. My clients who are most effective with this, they just commit to doing it for like a minute. They set a minute on their timer and they do it, and then they switch the dog back to a no pull device after that minute, and then they might try it again later. It is mentally exhausting, so you cannot go on like an enjoyable walk and do this, because you got to be paying attention all of the time, and you cannot just kind of enjoy your walk. So again, use equipment that helps you in the interim. Also, the human has to be physically able to do this. So the human has to be physically able to change pace easily and maintain pace well. So if the human cannot walk at a brisk pace for an extended period of time, this is not for them. If the human cannot walk super slowly, it's not for them. And not everybody can. And I have definitely like different days in which I can do this and days in which I simply cannot, as far as my personal stuff going on. So looking at the team in front of you and looking at yourself and thinking like, is this something I can do mentally and physically? It will work really well for you if you can't. If you can. If you can't, there's other techniques for you. You can use a device in slow your roll. You can do slow your roll with a front connection harness, a gentle leader, one of the other no pull devices, and it will help the dog to not pull on that device, which, hint, should be your goal. If you actually want loose leash walking, they need to learn how to not pull on the device as well, not just on the other equipment that you are using. So I'm going to show a little video, slow your roll. This is again Sweet Raya. We've got Felix on a downstay over there, which is actually going to add some challenge. So we're walking along. We've got a nice slack leash. She's going to tighten, and I'm going to immediately switch to slow motion. She's going to keep pulling for a second, and then she's going to be like, what is your deal? And then I'm going to speed right up. Good girl. She's maintaining. She responded to that just kind of collar pressure there. So I slowed down. And you see how it's like real time, quick changes. It is actually hard to do. I'm going to show you that again. So she's trotting along. Again, the cutest thing you've ever seen. She tightens. I slow down. Notice my bungee arm. This would be better if my arm was anchored. I am anchoring it now. Like I catch it in real time, but it did bungee at first. She did offer me a sit there. That kind of tells me that I slowed down too much. That tells me that I need to move better. There you go. But that time she responded really quickly to the leash pressure after having that snail's pace moment. Again, don't put your questions in the chat now. Put them in there later, please. All right, next technique is hey this way. I know, very, very creative. Hey this way is not brand new. It's been done a variety of ways. I hope to enlighten some changes that I've made for you. The biggest one being predictive, not reactive. So when I notice the dog is going to hit pressure, I'm going to tell them they're going to hit it. Then I'm going to slow down and anchor myself as they hit the tension. And then when they do hit that tension, I'm going to walk in another direction. So if you've been in dogs like forever, like I have, the Keeler method of dog training had a choke chain and a long line. And every time the dog hit the end of that long line, they strangled themselves and they learned to stay close to the person. And it was essentially this. But that's not what I'm teaching you. So as you notice that they're going to hit the tension, first of all, I'm not teaching you that they're on a choke chain. I didn't say that. As they're going to hit the pressure, I say, hey. That's why I call it hey this way, because that's just what comes out of my mouth. I say, hey, slow down, anchor myself, start to turn my body. When they notice I've turned, I walk a new direction. They might hit the end of the string, then notice, and then come with me. That's okay. That's kind of part of the process. I'm going to notice when the dog starts to actually avoid hitting the leash pressure on my cue, hey. So with my dogs now, I'm walking along, I see that they're going to pull, and I go, hey, and then they back off of it, and I go, oh, I'm going to hit the leash pressure, and then they don't hit it anymore, and I don't have to turn around. So really, really key is that you're noticing what their behavior is after you give the cue. So if you give the cue, hey, and they slow up, do not hit leash pressure, turn towards you, you want to reinforce that by walking forward. If you give the cue, hey, and they hit that leash pressure, that's when you're going to go the other direction. So of course I got a video. Walking along. And I'm just, she doesn't really pull because she's trained. So she got a sniff. So I said, hey, and we go the other direction. I want to stay in camera, which is why I did a full circle there, or I could have just kept walking. So now I'm going to let her sniff, let her get interested. Said, hey, leash tension, go another direction. It doesn't need to be a 180. It just needs to be another direction. Hey. Anchored leash. I am not bungeeing out when I say, hey. Now she's really noticing when I turn around and she's paying attention to my cues. So let's watch it again. Good girl. That was a good one there. Go the other way. And this is obviously a practice session. If you were going to use this technique, you would not necessarily be working on a trail in which you could only go like one direction or the other. I love this technique in big open fields, this open patio like this, things like that work really nicely. So let's talk a moment about reinforcement. You notice that I am not using a lot of food in these techniques. I did use food to teach that yield to collar pressure, and I do tend to give food just at the end of the session, which you might have noticed in the videos as well, just for the dog hanging in there with me through this demo. Here's why. There's this little pesky thing called a superimposed contingency, which is essentially that the original behavior, the pulling behavior that we're trying to get away from, has a function, and that function isn't food. The function is getting towards the thing they're pulling towards, walking faster. Those are the kinds of functions we're talking about. We're not talking about eating food from your hand. That's not going to be the function. So if you use food to train your loose leash walking, you will need to use food to maintain it forever. It will not easily transfer. That's why I don't use a lot of food. I don't want to feed them for the rest of their lives just for maintaining a loose leash. I absolutely feed them for the rest of their lives for a whole lot of behaviors. And if, let's say I'm asking for like tight loose leash walking, like I haven't given them much leash, like maybe I'm walking through a hotel or a conference or something like that, and I'm not giving them much space, I'm probably going to reinforce that with food. Why? because food also builds close loose leash walking. So if you've ever used food to try to build loose leash walking and then just built a really nice loose heel behavior where the dog is looking up and trotting next to you, but that's not actually what you want when you're walking in the neighborhood, the reason is you have superimposed a new contingency, which is food, upon the other contingency. So you've just kind of switched the entire game. So a functional reinforcer, which is going to be whatever the thing was the dog wanted in the first place, is almost always going to be motion forward or freedom of movement. And that's what you can give them instead. And that's what I'm doing in the videos that I've shown you so far. When they learn maintaining the loose leash accesses the thing that they were going to pull for, they learn to maintain the loose leash more effectively for you. Then, and I encourage you to do this, you can transfer to more exciting reinforcers. So an exciting reinforcer might be the thing that the dog is like lunging towards, like the squirrel, the rabbit. Once the dog understands how to maintain loose leash in order to access the functional reinforcers, you can apply this, you can insist that they maintain loose leash in the face of really exciting stuff. So once this is trained, you can and should apply it everywhere. I ask my dogs to walk on a loose leash in order to access agility, in order to access opportunities to run off leash, in order to access opportunities to play with their friends. All of those things are contingent on maintaining a loose leash. You do need to start with splits, of course. You need to start with easy stuff. So you could suggest to the dog, hey, do you want to go in that room? And ask them to walk on a loose leash with you into that room. That's kind of neutral to neutral, living room to kitchen or kitchen to living room, neutral to neutral. If you've got a border collie, no movement is neutral. And so that's probably going to be exciting and is a perfectly fine place to begin. Outside to inside or vice versa, and their dog is going to care more about one of those than the other, and so start with the one that they care less about, is another way that you can introduce this, rather than introducing it in a scenario where they have already learned to drag you towards the reinforcer. So that's kind of a big one. If they have already learned to drag you into the agility ring, you're not going to start next week with walking into the agility ring. I would stop practicing that by using a no-pull device to right away if that's something that you're interested in, but they're probably not going to be able to access that for you right away or quickly. This is the piece that if you attended my Crate to Gate webinar, you might have been confused or you might have just been frustrated about, because I said your dogs need to walk from the crate to the gate on a loose leash. And then I say there's loose leash training opportunities for you. Next slide. Well, these are the opportunities for you. I gave you the techniques. I gave you the hacks and things that you can use. This is where you have to start applying it in real life. Oh my goodness, this video is upside down. It's not upside down in real life. Okay, great. So here is a video of me doing this with Carson, little baby Carson. So let me start over. Let me dictate, because that threw me off that it was upside down to begin with. It is right side up. That's great. So little baby Carson, learning this now. I'd like her to walk on a loose leash in order to access training opportunities and things like that. And so I'm starting with getting to go outside. So I've thrown a kibble scatter for the other dogs so that they're not being too exciting, but they are outside and she'd like to join them. And I'm going to ask her to walk on a loose leash with me through the door. Good girl. She does really great that time. I'm going to let her kind of join in the scatter for a second, which is what everybody else is doing. And then she and I are going to head back in the door and we're just going to try it again. And this time, because she knows how cool it is outside, she's going to try to pull a little bit more. And I'm actually going to just employ the this way. So she hit that collar. I'm going to ask her to come this way. I'm going to do it a couple of times before she hits the leash. That's a nice response. And then I'm going to let her go out the door. I would not have done that back and forth if she hadn't been on her way to pulling. So that was not just because, it was because she was on her way to pulling on the leash. And that is the technique. When I see you're going to pull, I tell you this way, I turn the other way. So that's just beginning stages of Carson learning not to pull. Here's the thing, y'all. The make or break part of this is insisting. You have to insist on it. So the cue is present if the dog is on a leash. You want to use differentiating devices if you can't be consistent. And I've mentioned that throughout. So if you can't be consistent, you are going to want to put something on the dog that helps them to not pull so that they're not practicing pulling. If they're pulling into that thing, they are practicing pulling. So use those kind of different devices for yourself. It is not fair for you to have multiple sets of expectations. If you don't care if the dog drags you around on your neighborhood walks, but now you suddenly care that the dog drags you into the agility ring, or vice versa, that isn't fair. And insisting on this as just an always rule, an all the time thing, is going to make or break your success. I insist on it all the time, like I said, because it just hurts my body. Like I can't actually do it. And so for that reason, it's never an issue for me to have the dog kind of allowed to pull here and not allowed to pull there. But for people who are not in pain with the dog pulling, this does develop into an issue quite frequently. So thank you so much for coming. This is a topic that's really important to me. It was not important to everybody. So if you took it upon yourself to find it important today, I am so excited and I hope that you got something out of it. We're going to dive now into our Q&A. So this is the time for everybody to drop your questions into the chat. And I am going to stop recording. I think I have a few things already. Nope, I've just got a few things. Okay. So I'm going to stop the record.